The next part of your stained glass symmetry project is to ink and then color. So I want to talk about the inking process really quick. This is something you're probably used to if you've had the beginning art classes, but it's just always a good review. For the stained glass, we're going to be using a Sharpie fine point marker. These are really nice because they have a nice fine point on them. You can see that we've got a really sharp tip right there, and if we draw a line, you can see how thin that line is. And that's really what we want to go for. We want to be careful. The top of a felt tip marker is like a bunch of straws, and the ink just kind of flows out. If we just put our Sharpie on the paper and let it sit there, you'll notice how eventually it starts to create a very large dot. So we don't want to like stop in the middle of our line and then continue on, or else we see dots, and we want to avoid those dots. Okay. Another thing that we want to do is hold the Sharpie at an angle and pull. And since we're going to be using a ruler to get really nice straight lines, as we do this, we hold the marker at an angle. Notice I'm not straight up and down, I'm holding it at an angle, and I draw along the edge of the ruler to get a nice, even, straight line. This might take a little practice, but that's okay. Don't feel frustrated if it becomes too difficult. If we use the marker inappropriately, you'll notice how the tip of it starts to get rounded out, and eventually that bends the straws of the felt tip marker and doesn't allow the ink to flow as well. This is still a fairly new marker, but you can tell it's been pushed and been battered a lot. So when we draw our line, look at how much thicker that line is. That shows that this marker has been ruined and is not actually a fine tip marker anymore. At this point, it is just a Sharpie marker. And over time, it's not going to let the ink flow as well either. So we want to avoid using straight up and down, and we don't want to push too hard on the paper, and actually we just want to gently let our hand glide with it. So pull towards yourself. So when we're inking, and you can also see that we get bleed marks if we push too hard and let it sit too long. As we're inking our project, I'm going to use a plastic ruler. They seem to work better for inking. There's just a few things you want to be careful of. Make sure you don't let it smudge too much of your marker lines. So we're going to zoom in here so you can see a little closer some of the techniques that are good for inking. Notice when I ink, I'm going to get pretty close to that line, but I'm actually not covering the line. If I cover the line or I'm on it, then my ink line is going to be off to the right, and we don't want that. So we're going to come over here, and when you ink, line up and get close. Okay? I'm going to get that close, and you can just kind of look really close to your paper. As you zoom out, it might not look like you are that close, but you can see I'm going to be that close. So I've lined up my ruler, and then I'm going to, at an angle, pull the marker to get a nice even line. Now, as I use a plastic ruler, I'm going to use different sections of that plastic ruler as I continue to work. If I keep using the same section over and over again, it actually will have excess ink down on my marker and the ruler, and it can sometimes bleed and kind of go on the paper, and we want to avoid that. So you can see I'm just going to keep using different sections of this ruler as I go through and ink. Keeping my marker at an angle, I'm not pushing any pressure on my marker as I line up these and then draw. Trying to get really nice, even lines as I do this. Just a bit away from the line itself, marker at an angle, and then pull. Notice I'm never pushing towards. I always kind of want to pull away. And we take our time with this. If we take our time, we're for sure going to get some really good, nice inking lines, and it'll stand out really, really well. Just away from the line, line up, and then pull. And you'll continue that until you've got the entire project inked. Now we want to move on to talking about the coloring. Coloring your stained glass symmetry project is going to involve the use of gradient value, which we practiced a little bit before we actually started this project. So remember back to those good uses of gradient value. We want to move smoothly from one color or one value of that color to another. So here, I think I'm going to still color this orange because I need to keep it inside of its symmetrical color design. So I'm going to outline the area. When I do gradient value like this, I like to outline the area so I know where my darkest value is. It's just like on our actual gradient value scale where we start at the darkest. So I'm going to outline that area. You can see I'm using orange here. And then I'm actually going to go in the direction of kind of circular motions because this is a triangle, but we want to blend it together. You can see how on some of these we've started dark and we move in and eventually it kind of becomes rounded. And that's going to be a great way to actually blend in our colors. So you can see I'm not choked up on the top or tip of my pencil. I've come away a little bit and I'm using some lighter values as I go in here. Always easier to start off lighter and then work your way darker. Move around. You can see how it's still kind of a weird triangle shape, but I'm rounding off those edges, making it blend. That's going to help with our gradient values. Just using less pressure as I go towards the center. And at first, it's probably going to be pretty rough. There's going to be inconsistent areas, and you can see eventually I go into just like that circle area kind of in the center. Now, let's zoom in so we can see it a little bit better. You can see that it's not as well done as this other area, or this one, right? We're actually going to need to work on this a little bit more. So I'm going to go in and using really light coloring, I'm not using a ton of pressure. Very lightly, I'm going around in that same circular motion and area. The color direction on this gradient for these is going to be rounded and circular. Even though we start off with a geometric shape, we'll move into this. Now, if you just take your time, it's going to go better. If you go too dark too soon, it does not erase very well. And then you end up with color that you have to just leave because there's always going to be a little bit of color left with colored pencil. It doesn't go away all the way very well. So following those rounded kind of circular motions towards the center, you can see we're starting to get that blended. I'm going to kind of go along these edges right here where it's super dark. You can see that's blending in that dark to the other. Just moving through this to get it nice and blended. If you take your time with the coloring, it's going to look a lot neater and nicer than if you try to rush through it. So you can see here we've got this really dark line. I actually want to try to blend that in a little bit more. So using little circular motions, you'll notice my pencil's going in this direction, making circular motions. I'm going to go over that area with these circular motions, just a little bit of pressure, not a ton, just a bit, so that idea can blend in. And then immediately as I go towards this next area where I'm trying to blend, I use less pressure. You gotta just keep using less pressure. As you're doing this, we're not adding a ton of color, just a little bit at a time, trying to move it through. You can see that as you continue to add that, it starts to look more and more gradient. It starts to look a little more blended together. And you'll just continue that as you go on through other ones. Notice sometimes we can go darker to lighter in a horizontal or vertical, depending on how it is, and go from darker to lighter like we did on the gradient. But it's kind of fun to mix it up so that you've got differences, so that you've got some areas that stick out and some areas that kind of recede to the background. So just kind of think about what would look interesting on your design, and you're going to keep adding to it and using that gradient value.